On September 20th, 2006, an African-American man was arrested at a homeless shelter in Toronto, Canada. This man was found with roughly $10 worth of cocaine in his possession, which would have been a rather minor drug offense if he had been a Canadian citizen. Authorities would quickly learn that this was no simple drug offense because this man seemed to be a foreign national. This man's American passport said that he was Andrea Jerome Walker, a man born on January 22, 1973 in Wilmington, Delaware. A search of customs records revealed that he had entered Canada about a year prior, having arrived on an Amtrak train from New York in April of 2005. While he was only supposed to have stayed in Canada for 9 days, he had clearly exceeded that time frame with his arrest 17 months later. Authorities would later learn that he had been staying at a Salvation Army homeless shelter in Toronto until his arrest in September of 2006, and had been loosely involved with several religious groups in the area. After his arrest, this man, going by the alias of Andrea Walker, met with his lawyer, who encouraged him to plead guilty and accept a short stint in prison before being deported back to the US. He would follow up on his lawyer's advice and do just that, pleading guilty to drug possession. But this is where things became a bit strange. An examination of the man's passport said that this man was in his early 30s at the time of his arrest, having been born in 1973. But the man that Canadian authorities were interacting with was much older than that. When questioned, this man claimed that the information on his passport, the legal document he had used to book passage into another country, was simply wrong. He said that someone had made a mistake somewhere in the passport issuing process, and that his year of birth should have been 1963, not 73. This would cause authorities to begin examining his identity more closely than they would have normally, including US officials, who met with this man in jail to question him about his past. At the same time, they would begin running background checks on Andrea Jerome Walker, finding nothing about this individual that extended past the year 2001. Almost immediately, the passport for Andrea Jerome Walker would be revoked, with US authorities believing it to be a fraudulent identity, and then labeling this man as a non-citizen. From here, the investigation to figure out this man's true identity began, with his picture and fingerprints being sent to nations all over the globe, ranging from the Caribbean to further east in Europe and Africa. Because this man spoke several languages fluently, not only English and French, but Spanish as well, it was hard to determine where this man had originated from. When asked about why he spoke with a non-American accent, he insisted that his mother had been born in Cameroon, and that he learned French and Spanish on the streets of New York. Investigators would learn that this man had obtained his American passport in 2002, having previously attempted to do so a year earlier, 2001, but being rejected for a lack of original documents. It seems like he had figured out how to obtain these original documents, but had likely relied upon a fraudulent birth certificate to obtain his passport. After doing so, he had traveled from the United States to Spain in 2004, 1 year before heading to Canada, but had been deported back to the US for drug offenses, similar to the ones he was now facing in Canada. Later on, this man would claim to be a Haitian-born immigrant named Micheal G, but would later refute this very claim, insisting that he had never been to Haiti. Fingerprint records were later sent to Haitian authorities and came back as a negative match for anyone in their system, but the name Micheal G would actually pop up in the American justice system. A man with this name had been arrested in New York City for drug possession in 1993 and had later served his sentence on Rikers Island. When questioned, this man detained in a Canadian prison admitted that this was him and that his name was in fact Micheal G. But this identity would prove to be as much of an enigma as his prior identity, Andrea Jerome Walker. This identity, Micheal G. Hearns, had reportedly been born on September 14, 1966 in Haiti, and had immigrated to the US at an early age. As had been the case with Andrea Walker, Haitian authorities had no record of Micheal G. Hearns, and this man would later admit that this identity was an homage to the hip-hop artist Master G. When asked about the connection, this man stated, I love his music, that's why I use his name. I never been in Haiti. I don't even know where Haiti is. Authorities would spend nearly an entire decade attempting to learn the identity of this man, dubbed the Man with No Name by the press, as he either toyed with them or struggled to come to grips with his true identity after years of drug use and unchecked mental illness. Within that time, the UN Human Rights Council would condemn Canada for detaining this man for more than 9 years, with him enduring his prison sentence long past what he would have been given under the harshest sentencing guidelines. However, Canadian authorities would insist that they were eager to free the man and deport him back to wherever he had come from, but with him refusing to cooperate fully, or simply being unable to, they had nowhere to send him. An internal government report would read, "Subject has no family anywhere in the world. There is no one who knows him, and no one would be able to vouch for him. He claims to be entirely alone in this world." One of the steps that authorities had taken early on was to submit this man's fingerprints to Interpol, which came up with 8 different identities, all of which were believed to have been numerous aliases for this man over the years. However, one such name, unearthed by a Interpol search in 2010, came up with a convincing match. Micheal Whelan, born on September 14, 1959 in the African nation of Cameroon, had previously been arrested in Spain for drug violations, as well as resisting arrest and public mischief. When questioned about this identity, the Man with No Name would admit that this was him, but that his last name was Mavogo, not Miogo, which he insisted was a typo by Spanish authorities. However, attempts by Canadian authorities to reach out to Cameroon would prove unsuccessful in cementing this identification as truthful, because the Cameroonian government was unable to verify parts of this identity. It wasn't until March of 2015 that a liaison officer with Canada's Border Services Agency was able to travel to Cameroon, where they began researching the mysterious Micheal Mavogo in the area that he had supposedly been born in. There, they would unearth a birth certificate stub with the details of his birth, as well as a family member, an uncle, that would confirm certain details of Mavogo's youth. This information would later be compiled into a report, which read, 3 days of research in rural Cameroon led to the discovery of the birth certificate needed to prove the identity/Cameroonian citizenship of a long-term detention removal case. In August of 2015, this Man with No Name was finally deported to Cameroon, although Canadian authorities were unable to divulge any specific details. This would bring this issue to an end after nearly a decade, with Micheal Mavogo serving 10 years in a Canadian prison for a relatively minor drug offense because he would not divulge his identity to authorities. But by this point, the Canadian government was already dealing with a nearly identical case, which, unlike Micheal Mavogo's identity, remains a mystery today. This is the story of Herman Emmanuel Fankem, also known as the Unknown Person.
The Toronto Police Service Financial Crimes Unit would like to make the public aware of a scam that we call the black money scam.
A black money scam, also known as a black dollar or wash scam, is a variation of the typical advanced fee fraud, which you may know as the Nigerian prince scam. In this scheme, an individual or group will have a large amount of money that needs cleaning, quite literally. They will have a large amount of cash that is covered in oil, dye, powder, or some other concealing substance, in order to avoid detection by customs or law enforcement. This money will then need to be cleaned in order to become usable currency, which is where the scheme begins. Those involved will attempt to lure in those that they would be defrauding, those perceived to be gullible, and offer up a cut of the proceeds for a down payment. This down payment would be used to purchase chemicals needed to clean the money, but would likely be followed up by request for future payments. I'll let Detective Alan Spratt of the Toronto Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit explain it from here.
The way the scam works is that the suspects will make some type of contact with a victim, usually under some non-related pretext. The victim might be seeking a loan for a business venture, selling some type of item. There's various reasons, but the suspects will make contact with the victim under that pretext. And then when it comes to discussions about money, the suspects will bring up the fact that they have a large pool of money somewhere in a foreign country, and for various reasons they need to smuggle this money into Canada. And the way they do it is they disguise the money with a powder that turns the money black. And then what happens is they tell the victim that to take the disguise off the money, they need special chemicals that are very expensive. And in these scams, they'll come up with various reasons why money's needed, and they'll ask the victim to pay these monies, and they'll just keep coming up with reasons for the victim to pay money until eventually the victim realizes it's a fraud scam.
In April of 2013, the Toronto Police Financial Crimes Unit made an arrest in a case involving a black money scam, in which an individual had been duped out of nearly $500,000. The prior October, the victim in this case had been contacted by approximately 5 men, who responded to a real estate advertisement that the victim had placed, in which he was looking to sell a commercial property. The individuals that reached out to him said that they would pay for the property with money that they had coming in from South Africa, which would require cleaning upon arrival, having been covered in a dark powder. For the deal to go through, however, the scammers convinced the victim that he would need to pay for the chemicals needed to clean the cash, which he was told were quite expensive. Over the next several months, the victim would end up getting sucked further and further into the scheme, giving the scammers approximately $450,000, before learning that the money covered in black dye was nothing but construction paper. Despite losing such a large amount of money, he was faced with the harsh reality that he had been taken in by a scheme as old as humanity itself, and was likely not the only victim of this crime outfit. This would cause Alan Spratt of Toronto's Financial Crimes Unit to hold a press conference on April 15th, 2013, during which he asked for other victims to come forward and insisted that the investigation was ongoing. He also spoke briefly about the only arrested suspect so far, a 32-year-old man from Montreal that went by the name of Herman Emmanuel Fankem, who had been arrested approximately 1 week prior, April 9th, and had been charged with 1 count of fraud over $5,000.
This past Tuesday, April 9th, we arrested an individual, and it's alleged that this individual was involved in a black money type scam. The individual is pictured on the screen to my right, and we're asking any members of the public who have had any dealings with this individual to come forward, contact Toronto Police Financial Crimes Unit, and we'd like to speak with them. We suspect that there may be other victims out there, and we also believe there's people, members of the public, that will have information to assist us with this investigation.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular case? I mean, I know he was defrauded of what, $450,000? Is that right?
Yes.
So what was he needing? What sort of loan was the victim needing? And what money was he told he would need to pay to smuggle this money in and get it cleaned and all of that?
I don't want to get into the actual evidence of the case. Well, I'll speak in generalities. So in the cases that I've seen, there's a number of different reasons. Some of the payments are for chemicals. Some of the other payments will be for shipments, things that are stopped in customs, and there's various excuses. Often they'll bring documents for the victim to sign. Sometimes they'll claim there's accounting fees and counting fees, and there's a myriad of different excuses that the suspects will come up with in these scams. But like I said, once the victim's bought in, then the victim's, it's believable to the victim from that point on.
And this man was allegedly operating out of Toronto?
Yes, that's correct.
And the victim was here as well?
The victim's Toronto resident.
So this man was allegedly telling the victim that I have connections in another country and I can bring this money in for you?
There's more in this investigation. There's more than one suspect. So we've apprehended this individual, and we believe there's other suspects. So there's been different communications with the victim that we're still investigating.
And the
You got it readily available.
Yes.
the $450K is a summation of all the different charges he was given, like we need to do this to bring in the money, this to clean the money.
That's correct.
Okay, and you don't want to say how much money it was that,
It was approximately
how
$450,000.
much he was selling the property for?
Oh, I don't remember that offhand. So.
What about the other suspects? Anything on them?
Well, we're still investigating, and we are looking for other suspects.
How many do you think?
We believe there could be up to 4 other suspects.
The man arrested by Canadian authorities in April of 2013 was learned to have arrived in Canada on October 28, 2012. Having arrived on a flight from Cuba, this man had provided customs with a French passport that bore the name Herman Emmanuel Fankem. Explaining his visit, this man told customs officials that he was going to be in town for his friend's sister's wake, and provided plans to stay at a Days Inn in Montreal, as well as proof of his return plane ticket to Cuba, and approximately $3,000 in his bank account. He explained that he was no stranger to Canada, having visited once more about 6 months prior, and had supposedly flown back to France about 1 week before this visit. He was granted a 10-day visitor's visa, meaning he was supposed to have left the country by November 7th, which he had obviously exceeded. While not much is known about this man's activities in the 6 months he was in Canada, he was known to be involved with a group that perpetrated the black money scam, using a rumored connection to South African money to defraud a Toronto area man out of approximately $500,000. He was arrested on April 9th, 2013, while staying at a hotel in Toronto under a different name. Following his arrest, he told police that his passport was at his apartment in Montreal, and was later charged with 2 counts of fraud and personation. None of his accomplices would ever be caught, so the exact details of this criminal organization remain unknown to the public. It's been reported by several outlets, including the National Post, that this man was very civil with law enforcement following his arrest. This is when the man believed that he was going to be quickly deported to France to serve out his sentence there. When questioned, he insisted that he was a French citizen and did not have citizenship in another nation, despite him constantly traveling for work, stating in his first court appearance, "I am French, but I work in England." In this first court hearing, which took place on August 22nd, 2013, the man would demand to face a trial there in Canada, instead of being deported overseas to stand trial there. This would become the first demand of many, with the man seeming to prefer remaining in Canada instead of having his citizenship or backstory explored any further. He would also begin to complain about the duration of time he had already spent incarcerated, just 4 months, unaware of just how long he would end up spending in Canadian prisons. Because, as it turns out, the identity that this man had been operating under was a complete fake. His entire identity, down to the French passport he used to enter Canada, was based on fraudulent information. Canadian authorities would not learn about this deception until he was already in their custody, and at that point, he was now their problem to deal with. The man calling himself Herman Emmanuel Fankem would end up being sent to stay at a maximum security prison in Ontario while authorities probed his backstory, not only for known criminal connections but gaps in his past. In the meantime, his original charges, which were temporarily stayed until his identity could be confirmed, would eventually be dropped to allow for quick deportation. This man would appear in front of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board several times, and would consistently refuse to divulge any information about himself. He would even refuse to cooperate with authorities attempting to learn about his past, more often than not appearing combative with public officials, and telling them to go fuck themselves. He appears to have adopted this abrasive edge to his personality after being told that he wasn't being deported to France because his passport was not being accepted, likely knowing at this point that his long-term ruse was up. In a April 2017 appearance with the Immigration and Refugee Board, which was being held through a video feed from the Lindsay, Ontario prison he was being held in. This man reportedly told the adjudicator to go to hell and refused to answer any questions. When asked whether or not the adjudicator was speaking to the correct person, he answered, "I don't care." And when the adjudicator formally began the proceeding, this man stated, "I don't care what you do. You can go to hell. That's all I have to say to you. Go to hell." The man would then go storming off in the middle of the hearing, much to the confusion of the adjudicator and other officials present. This has become one of his many regular behaviors, however, with him refusing to even attend several of his court hearings, even though they are similarly being held via video feed. On the off chance that he does attend, he is known for being just as combative as I just described, if not more so. Despite attempting to speak to French authorities several times, this man would refuse to meet with them when the opportunity finally presented itself, for reasons that are still unknown. The man would continue to insist that he was a French citizen named Herman Emmanuel Fankem, despite French authorities stating that this was a fake identity. He did, however, have some kind of a record in France, at least. In October of 2013, authorities from Paris told the Canadian government that this man had attempted to obtain legal documents through illegitimate means, having attempted to use a fake birth certificate to obtain ID cards and other necessary travel documents. However, the names and dates from the birth certificate did not match up with anyone in French records, meaning that this was likely a persona that had been concocted out of thin air. That being said, the name that this man was using, Herman Emmanuel Fankem, had links to a prior criminal ring operating out of France, which had been selling fake passports for approximately 750 euros each. An investigation by French police had led to the arrest of the man who created the passports, as well as a man using it while attempting to fly to Canada, but the latter was unfortunately released without seeing any charges. It's believed this might have been the same man, using the same identity and or passport to eventually smuggle his way into Canada through Cuba. In 2014, the Canadian Border Services Agency, who had been tasked with finding this man's identity and deporting him, was told by the French government that this man was likely from the African nation of Cameroon, seeing as he did not have any kind of legitimate record in France. 2 years later, an investigator from Cameroon was able to link this mysterious individual to a specific area, using pictures of the man and showing them around to locals until he found someone that allegedly knew him. This witness claims that the man in question, who had since earned the identifier the unknown person, was a clothing vendor in Cameroon that had eventually moved away to the United Kingdom. UK government services would provide their own information about the man to Canada's Border Service Agency, including fingerprints for a man named Herman Emmanuel Fankem, a Cameroonian that was interviewed by British immigration agents in 2007 and was allowed to travel through England. According to this man at the time, he did not want to stay in the UK and purchased an airline ticket to Canada. However, he appears to have stayed in the country for some time, because he was soon arrested for a couple of offenses, including possession of fraudulent documents, which earned him 8 months incarceration, and then again, for frauds committed under a different name in 2009, which earned him an additional 12 months in prison. Afterward, this man seemed to have finally made his way to Canada, although his route to get there is clouded in mystery. It's not publicly known whether or not he was deported to France beforehand. He eventually made his way to Canada through Cuba, but his fingerprints would be matched up to a few other IDs from Britain, including another citizen from Cameroon, a man from Haiti, and another unknown man of undetermined origin. Because of these details, many believe that Cameroon is the most likely location that this man came from. Not only is it a predominantly French-speaking nation, but it also appears to be where this man's first identities hailed from, including Herman Emmanuel Fankem, which many believe might be this man's real name. However, because of the uncertainty surrounding this story, it's just as likely that he hailed from any of the other French-speaking nations in Africa, including Tunisia, the Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Morocco, and Algeria, among others. In the years since the unknown person was apprehended by Canadian authorities, some have speculated that he would rather just stay there, in a Canadian prison, then go back to wherever he came from. While this is just a theory, it would explain why he has been so belligerent and uncooperative with authorities, providing them with close to no usable information in almost a decade, despite remaining in a maximum security prison for a majority of that time. Because of his rumored ties to Cameroon, as well as the fact that his trail seems to have picked up in the mid-2000s, he might have been attempting to flee the northern section of the country at around the same time that the terrorist group Boko Haram came to prominence. Perhaps he fears being sent back, having alienated certain people there that might mean to do him harm. It is also possible, based on what we already know about him, that this man might have had involvement in a larger criminal organization from that region. We know that he had at least 2 accomplices for the scheme he was carrying out in Canada, both of whom were reportedly never captured by law enforcement. Perhaps they had fled with what money they had managed to obtain through their fraudulent enterprise, but may hold the unknown person responsible for foiling their plans to make off with even greater riches. Maybe this man fears retaliation by this group for getting arrested, and putting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars at risk of being lost. During my research for this episode, I learned a little bit about the Black Axe Group, a fraternal order of criminals from Nigeria who have defrauded millions of dollars from people throughout North America, including several victims in Canada, similar to the Toronto man that the unknown person and his associates ripped off. The organization is an international death cult to whom members literally swear a blood oath, and has been spreading far outside of Nigeria over the past several years. In the past 15 years in particular, they have started several chapters in North America, and have been linked to several murders and rapes in that span. Not only atrocities committed in Nigeria, but even acts of violence carried out in the US and Canada. While the Black Axe Group is just one of many similar groups, they have become one of the most well-known, as Canadian authorities have come to learn about this group very recently. While members of the group are believed to perpetrate primarily romance scams, preying upon moderately wealthy widows and the like, their existence has only come to light over the past few years, with Canadian and American authorities learning about the group's existence through numerous other fraud investigations. It's currently believed that the Black Axe Group has been active in North America since 2005 or so, a timeline that appears to correlate to when this man started to appear in the international record. While I think that there is something to this potential link to a larger organized crime ring, which may make the unknown person afraid to be deported for fear of reprisal or punishment of some kind. It's also just possible that he does not want to spend time in a Cameroonian prison, since most of the evidence points to this man coming from Cameroon. If this man is to be deported anywhere in the world, the odds are likely that he would be sent there to serve his prison time, and prisons in Cameroon are notoriously terrible, having an obscene occupancy level that makes American prisons look hospitable in comparison. However, it's also possible, as was the case with Micheal Whelan, the Cameroonian man I detailed in the episode introduction, that something like mental illness might be in play here. Perhaps this man does not fully comprehend the situation that he is in, and would rather stay in prison than cooperate with authorities, with him insisting over the years that he has been quote-unquote kidnapped by the Canadian government. Over the years, the Canadian government has made several attempts to reach out to other nations in their quest to determine this unknown person's nation of origin. While they have failed to do that so far, they have uncovered several leads that point to a more complicated situation than originally thought. For example, officials in Germany came back with a hit for this man's identity, but an internal note from Canada's Border Service Agency reads, "We are not permitted to disclose it." While this does seem incredibly vague, it also seems to point to this man's identity having some kind of importance, at least with it potentially being linked to an active and ongoing investigation, perhaps something tied into a larger immigration or identity fraud case spanning multiple nations. If we allow ourselves to think even larger in scope, our minds begin to wander to something spy-like. with this man's identity being withheld from the public for reasons unknown. Speculation about what this may mean went into overdrive in 2019, when the unknown person was scheduled to appear in front of the Immigration and Refugee Board yet again. Before the hearing, however, the man's lawyers requested that it be closed to the public and the press. As a rule, almost all hearings in front of this board are made open to the public, unless there is a real and substantial risk to the fairness of the proceedings such that the need to prevent disclosure outweighs the societal interest. Which there apparently was, at least enough to make this hearing a closed session. Regarding this, the unknown person's lawyer would state, "The presence of media at hearings and Mr. Fankem being transported to various locations to accommodate media presence may prove to be overly stressful to him, and may lead him to revert to his past practice of non-participation." It remains unknown why exactly. This and subsequent hearings in front of the Immigration and Refugee Board were made private, as this is only usually done in the most extreme of circumstances. Perhaps it may tie into the unknown person's ongoing criminal case. Even though charges against him have been dropped, it's possible he faces future crimes or does not want to incriminate himself in any. Or perhaps it ties into a separate, ongoing investigation, which may or may not be tied into the lead from Germany that Canadian authorities were unable to disclose to the public. The courts have ruled that they don't want to create any additional distress for this individual or his ongoing case, and seem to fear that public disclosures may be harmful to him. For that reason, not much about this man's current situation is publicly known. To date, the investigation in determining this man's true identity has spanned 11 countries from 3 separate continents. Investigators have used similar methods from the Micheal Whelan investigation in an attempt to learn this man's name, including running down several leads in Cameroon and Haiti. As you've heard throughout this episode, those efforts have been unsuccessful thus far, instead just revealing a weird and slightly complicated labyrinth of aliases from multiple countries that this man had used over several years. Meanwhile, the efforts from his end have been pretty abysmal, with him refusing to attend dozens of detention review hearings and not only appearing combative with authorities, but refusing to cooperate and openly mocking the judicial process. In 2018, a court ordered the unknown person to be released from prison, believing that the nation had exceeded its authority by keeping him locked up for so long with no conviction. But an appeal was made and taken up to federal court. There, Judge B. Richard Bell would write, "During the course of the hearing before me, both counsel observed that this matter is complicated for all concerned. I disagreed. It may be complicated for detention review officers, lawyers, judges, and CBSA officials. It appears not to be at all complicated for the unknown person. This court's impression is that the unknown person considers himself to be the director of a play, and Canadian authorities are but actors subject to his direction." Judge Bell believed that releasing the man back into Canada, for him to only disappear among the public without authorities ever learning his identity, would strain all sense of logic. It's believed that an investigation into this man's identity continues to this day, nearly a decade after his apprehension, but the Canadian government remains tight-lipped about its current status, as well as the status of the man himself, until such a time that he is finally identified. The story of the unknown person will remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode of the show was researched, written, and produced by myself, and the music throughout this episode was put together by yours truly through Amber Music. The song you're hearing right now, however, The Unresolved theme song was written and composed by Ilsa Traves. For a full list of sources and references, please head to the podcast website at unresolved.me to learn more. Now, I would like to take a minute to thank the producers of this podcast, who support the show each month through Patreon. These wonderful people are Roberta Jansen, Ben Crocum, Gabriella Bromley, Stephen Wilson, Quill Carter, Travis Sepko, Laura Hannon, Brian Hall, Damian Moore, Scott Meesey, Amy Hampton, Scott Patzold, Marie Vengland, Astrid Nair, Aime McGregor, Joe Wong, Sarah Moscaritolo, Sydney Scotton, Thomas Ahern, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Rebecca O'Sullivan, Meadow Landry, Tatum Bautista, Sally Ranford, Kevin McCracken, Ruth Durbin, Michelle Watson, Jared Midwood, Tunya Elzinga, Ryan Green, Jacinta C., Stephanie Joyner, and Cherish Brady. Thank you all so much, and thank you to everyone for listening. Until next time, I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy. I'll talk to you later.